In this video, we're going to be going over some basic ingredient substitutions that you can use if you're missing an ingredient or if you need to replace some things based on your dietary restrictions or just based on what you prefer. The first substitution we're going to be going over is for cake flour. Most people don't keep cake flour in their house, but it's used for a lot of recipes for cakes that you'll come across. So for this substitution, we're going to be using all-purpose flour. The substitution for this, you're going to use a substitution for each cup of cake flour. So you're going to start out with a cup of all-purpose flour and remove 2 tablespoons of it, or that's 7/8 of a cup of all-purpose flour. Cake flour has less gluten in it than all-purpose flour, so you're not going to get the exact same result as you would if you use cake flour, and cake flour is also milled to a lot finer of a grain, so this is not going to be an exact substitution. Your product is just not going to be as high quality if you use the substitution, but it will work in a pinch. So as I said, most of us don't have 8 cups, so just remove 2 tablespoons is the easiest way to do that. The next substitution we're going to be talking about is for self-rising flour. This substitution is very important because this is not something that a lot of people purchase on a regular basis. So for each cup of self-rising flour, you're going to use a cup of all-purpose flour, a teaspoon of baking powder, and a half teaspoon of salt. And that is what self-rising flour is. It's just regular all-purpose flour with those things added in to save you the step of adding them in. The thing that a lot of people don't realize about self-rising flour is that over time it's going to lose its potency and stop working. So you might notice the longer you keep it around, the less well your recipes are going to work. So this substitution actually may work better than using self-rising flour to begin with. After you've added those things in, you want to stir it together before you add it into any recipes, just so that you make sure those dry ingredients are incorporated together. For this reason, I never purchase self-rising flour. I use this substitution exclusively. One of the most common ingredient substitutions is going to be the one for buttermilk. Most people don't keep this in their house just because it's very easy to forget, but most of us do keep milk in the house. So for each cup of buttermilk, you're going to grab your liquid measuring cup, put a tablespoon of vinegar or lemon juice in that measuring cup, and then you're going to fill it up the rest of the way to equal that cup. I usually prefer to use lemon juice, and that helps out with browning a little bit as well, and I just prefer the flavor of that, but you can always use whatever that you like or whatever you have. Make sure that you stir it up to incorporate the acid into the milk. That's going to help with the process of interacting with any baking soda that's in the recipe. That's going to help with the rise of the final product. You also want to let it sit for a few minutes just to make sure that the consistency of the milk is correct as well. If you're ever trying to reduce the fat in any recipe that involves eggs, there is a way to do that by changing up the part of the egg that you use. And the easiest way to do that is to use 2 egg whites for each whole egg in a recipe. Egg whites don't have any fat in them, and so you can just separate out the yolks and discard those if you are trying to save fat in any sort of recipe. Just keep in mind that the yolks do have a function in the recipe, so you can't do this with every recipe without changing the final product. You can separate eggs with the shell and your hands. Because the final product is going to be cooked, it's not a food safety risk, or you can use an egg separator. I generally don't use an egg separator, mostly because whenever I'm cracking eggs, I forget to grab it, and hands are a much cheaper thing, and they're a lot easier to wash than another dish. Cornstarch is used to thicken a lot of sauces, gravies, and desserts. But it also is something that a lot of people don't keep in their house. So a substitution that you can use for that is for every tablespoon of cornstarch, you can use 2 tablespoons of all-purpose flour. But something that you also want to think about with this is that flour does not work quite as well as cornstarch. That's the reason that you need to use more. The other thing you want to think about is that flour has a very starchy flavor whenever you put it into things to thicken it. Generally, it's used in roux for thickening, which means you cook it with fat to get that starchy flavor out. So whatever you're cooking when you use flour in the substitution, you're going to need to cook longer than you would cook whatever you were using cornstarch for. Corn syrup is used in a lot of cooked candy and icing recipes. It has a very specific function in those recipes that we'll talk about in a second. But if you need to substitute for corn syrup, for each cup of syrup you're using, you're going to use 1 1/3 cups of sugar, and then whatever liquid is in your recipe, you're going to mix that sugar with about 1/4 of a cup of that liquid. So what you want to think about when it comes to corn syrup is it interferes with the crystallization of sugar. So whenever you are eating candy and it has that smooth texture, corn syrup is what contributes to that. So if you don't have corn syrup in that candy recipe and you're using the sugar replacement, there's a good chance your final candy will be grainy. So if you have the opportunity to get corn syrup, it's usually best for your final product to have the corn syrup to begin with. Baking chocolate is something that's used in a lot of brownie recipes, cake recipes, and dessert recipes. And the good news is that this substitution is one that can be used without a lot of impact on the final product. For each square of baking chocolate that's called for in your recipe, you want to use 3 tablespoons of cocoa, which is like the Hershey's cocoa you buy in the store, and 1 tablespoon of butter or oil. The baking cocoa has all of the fat removed from it, and so that butter or oil is going to replace the fat that was in there. And so this ends up being very similar to the final product. And this is for unsweetened baking chocolate. For semi-sweet baking chocolate, for 1 2/3 ounce of semi-sweet chocolate, you want to use 1 ounce of unsweetened chocolate and 4 tablespoons of sugar, or 1 ounce of chocolate chips and 1 tablespoon of shortening. So the semi-sweet chocolate you would use for baking as well. So if you don't have baking powder for any of your baking recipes, you can substitute other things that you have in your kitchen. So for each teaspoon of baking powder, you're going to use 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda and 1/2 teaspoon of cream of tartar. If you don't have cream of tartar, you can also use other acids such as lemon juice or vinegar. If your recipe calls for something like buttermilk or yogurt or things like that, the baking soda would react with that as well. The other thing that you need to remember about this substitution is that all baking powder that's sold is what is called double acting. And so that double acting baking soda means that it reacts once to moisture when you add the water or whatever liquid you have in the recipe to your recipe, and then it reacts again to heat. So if you're using this substitution, it's only going to react to the moisture. And so that means you need to bake these things or cook them very, very quickly after you add any liquid to the recipe. A lot of people need to go gluten-free for a variety of reasons, and that's become a lot easier in recent years with one-to-one baking mixes and things like that. But something that you need to understand about substituting these baking flours is that there is a big difference between this and regular traditional flours because they don't contain gluten. So just when you're making these substitutions, understand that it's going to work well for things like cookies, cakes, and muffins because they don't need to hold up very well. But for things like yeast spreads, you're not going to get a very high quality end product. So dry mustard is something that's used in a lot of recipes for things like fondue or for recipes for things like potato salad. If you don't have dry mustard, a super easy substitution to use is for every teaspoon of ground mustard that is called for in the recipe, use a tablespoon of prepared mustard. When fresh cloves of garlic are called for in a recipe, there is a substitution for granulated garlic that you keep in your pantry. So the substitution is for every 1 clove of garlic, you're going to use 1/8 of a teaspoon of garlic powder. The thing that you want to keep in mind with this is that it takes a little bit for the garlic powder to hydrate, so the longer that it sits, the more flavor that you're going to get. So the last substitution that we're going to be talking about is for fresh herbs. So when a recipe calls for 1 tablespoon of a chopped fresh herb, you're going to use 1 teaspoon of that herb in a dry form. The thing that you want to think about with this is kind of the same thing that we were talking about with the garlic. That herb has been dried out, and so whatever water that's in the recipe is going to hydrate it over time and intensify the flavors. So let that recipe sit for a little bit to allow for the flavors to develop. I hope these substitutions help you with following some of your recipes in a little bit easier way and to help you in finding some substitutions in your pantry. Thank you for joining us on Mixing with Merks, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.